All right, is that all right?
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Okay, so first of all, my name is Matt Luckett. I'm a professor of history, or actually history lecturer at Sac State and at Sierra College. So I specialize in the American West. I live right here in Orangevale. I recently published my first book, up here, Never Caught Twice. So I actually lecture about how to do history at Sac State. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is from that, my very first lecture, although I'm not going to give you the whole lecture because that's a long time. We all have places to be and things to do. So this is very much an abbreviated version of that. And it's directed to the work that we're doing here at the OV Historical Society. But I want to talk a little bit about sources and, you know, what sources are, what they mean, and just kind of give like the granular history, you know, talk about how we approach them and what they are. So I was going to start with a quote from Canticle for Leibowitz, but we'll just dispense with that for now. I don't know if anyone's read that. It's an incredible book. It's science fiction. It's a good way to kind of think about history and the impermanence of history. And maybe that's just a good way to kind of think about it, is that history is very impermanent, right? All we know about history is what we get from books and what we get from articles and what we get from spoken word, from oral stories passed down to us and things like that, right? Like once something's happened, it's gone. And we sort of take that for granted today with videos and you know, audio recordings and things like that. We tend to forget that for almost all of human history, we haven't had anything as permanent or as etched in stone as we have today. So that's really where we start with this, right? Like sources are evidence from the past. So before we talk a little bit more about that, for those of you following along on Zoom, the Orangevale Historical Society has a number of really important, oh, great. Yeah, it's already on. Awesome. Again, we're figuring all this out again. Local historical societies in general provide a vital service to the public. They preserve local documents, which is obviously something we're already starting to do. They chronicle local stories, which again is something we're already starting to do. And they educate the public, which is something I think we're just now starting to think about as a historical society in terms of how we get what we come up with here and what we collect here and put it out there to those people, by which I mean everybody, right? And they also provide, speaking mainly for myself and for other historians, they provide a vital service for us as well. They provide a repository of experience in local history. They facilitate the preservation of important documents. They form important partnerships with other institutions. So speaking as someone who does research, I love it when there's an engaged local historical society that A, answers the phone, not always a given. B, answers their email, also not always a given. And C, has a pretty good idea of, you know, the local historical landscape in terms of what sources are out there and what to access. So it's a really important thing that we're doing here. And thank you all again for being a big part of this. This is incredibly important. So let's talk a little bit about sources. So today I'll kind of do like my primary sources 101 spiel. We'll talk a little bit about some documents that are worth saving. We'll talk a little bit about some documents that aren't worth saving, and they're not all worth saving. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of the scalability of documents. So when we get documents, like the more documents we have, the more money, labor, et cetera, is associated with keeping them. And then finally, just a few ideas for categorizing them, which I think is what Marilyn actually asked me to do, and I saved that for the very last slide. But I'm going to give you some ideas for actually how to kind of venture forth and find some ideas for how to organize and how to label everything too. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So what's a primary source, right? A primary source is literally anything that has historical information. It can be a book, it can be a lecture, it can be a movie, a song, a journal, furniture, letters, a building, anything that communicates historical information. So without sources, we would know nothing about our history. So like I alluded to before, right? Like that's how we know what happened in the past. It's you know, at some point or another, there's enough entropy with what we know and what we can kind of keep in our mind about historical information that at some point we have to remember it. I think somebody just entered the.
That's me.
Oh, that's okay. Great. Sorry. So it's really important to keep as many sources, you know, as we can. Obviously, they're the official human record. There's no backup drive for it. So if somebody's World War II letter gets burned up in a fire, that's it, right? There's no going back to it. And one thing we're starting to face now is with backwards compatibility, you know, things from the 1990s, the early aughts, we're having trouble getting a lot of that stuff now. Like, how many of you guys have 5.5 or 5.25 floppies lying around your house? Do you have a drive for it?
Hidden in the garage.
Hidden in the garage somewhere, right? But like, there's a lot of information on those drives, and yeah, and it's all starting to erode a little bit, right? So we have this constant challenge of safeguarding the present in order to make that historical information in the future. So historians seek out, expose, contextualize, teach, and even create historical sources, by which I mean like lectures and books and things like that. So historians, broadly defined, including all of us, are humanities archivists and storytellers. So primary sources help historians, and really anybody who's curious, answer historical questions. It can be a big question like who won World War II, to a small question like what kind of rifle did the Canadians use in D-Day? And that's the Lee Enfield, by the way. So ideally, we can answer our questions using existing sources that we can just get the Orangevale Public Library. But when we can't, we go to our well of primary sources. We try to answer that question for ourselves. So one thing you should note too is that all academic history sources should be cited. If it's an academic publisher, it is cited. By which I mean, if you read a history professor who wrote a book and there's some claim in there that you're not really sure about or you're questioning it, go to the footnote or go to the endnote, and then you can trace that idea, that fact, back to where it came from. So that way you can kind of chase the paper trail yourself and see where that claim came from. So we all do that. Like, it's full accountability. So one popular misconception that I try to correct whenever I can is like historians are just making all this crap up. Like, we can't. Like, we have literally all of our notes are, you know, all my notes about horse stealing are in the back of this, like some 50 odd pages of it. So it takes a long time, but it's all there. You can check it all out. And you can follow like the building blocks as they're kind of being laid out. Primary sources provide evidence from the past. Secondary sources are what historians do, right? Their narrative, their lectures, their books, their articles that contextualize the past. And they're really important too, right? Like, one thing I've heard, another sort of misconception is that historians are rewriting or revising history. And the truth is we're constantly revising history, because history it's completely what we think and say and read about the past, right? It all comes down to the stories that we tell ourselves about the past. And those stories are always changing because what's important to us is always changing. And we're also constantly finding out new things, right? Like, believe it or not, we've discovered a whole lot about the fall of the Roman Empire in just the last 20 years that you might not have heard like in a high school or college textbook, but because of archaeology, we discovered a whole lot more about it. We know so much more now about the 7th century than we did just 20 years ago. So we're constantly adding to what we know, and that's what you're going to be doing. Anytime someone tells us a story, anytime we record an interview, anytime we collect photos or something like that, we are adding more grist to the mill, right? That's more history that we have access to. Those are more stories that we can tell. So it's not just we're constantly like revising what we think about the past, we're constantly adding to what we know about it too. So that's really exciting, and that's super incredibly important work. Just a couple more words about primary sources. Historians constantly have to find this balance when seeking out primary sources. So like, on the one hand, like I just alluded to, there's not a whole lot of stuff about 7th century Rome. But on the other hand, like, there's a ton of stuff about the 20th century. And this will kind of go to what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes with what we're doing. So like, for instance, 16 million Americans served in World War II. The average service record, if you go to the NPRC in St. Louis and request a service record, it's about 50 pages long. So what's 16 million times 50? I don't even know. My brain's fried, right? It's a lot. So like that's literally the amount of paper we have just from service records about World War II servicemen. So the 20th century has a huge amount of information that's still out there. We've only like scratched the surface of it. So, you know, when you're processing documents or bringing documents to the society, that's definitely something to think about. You know, we have some of these things already, or we have access to them. One more thing about sources, in terms of interrogating them. Not all sources are truthful. Not all sources are accurate. That's definitely something to think about whenever you get a source or whenever you get a letter or a diary or something like that. Or even if you're, you know, I know everybody in Orangevale always tells the truth. But, you know, for those Fair Oaks people, okay, like if you're interviewing them, you know, like don't always take what they say for granted. Like chase it down, right? If there's something that doesn't make sense, ask them about it, follow up about it. You know, don't just take people's, you know, word for it, right? You want to be able to kind of figure out where those tensions are because, you know, whenever you get 5 people in the same room, they leave, they talk about what happened, you're going to have like 6 different opinions or interpretations of that, right? And so that's kind of what history is, right? It's figuring out not necessarily who's lying or who's telling the truth, but, you know, where everybody agrees on. And then finding out, like kind of sussing out where those differences might be. So it's a little bit like, I think Judge Judy is a really good example of that. You know, like Judge Judy, she always has like the 2 sides, you know, and she's very good about picking out who's telling the truth, who isn't, who might be embellishing just a little bit. And that's kind of what historians do too. Because not everybody has a, not everybody remembers things accurately. Maybe that's a charitable way to put it. So one of the things we try to do is figure out where the truth is. And that's not always an easy thing to do. There's a lot of different state and local repositories of sources. So obviously this is one. One really good one to think about is the Online Archive of California. And I really encourage everybody to just check that out and see what is available just in the state. The Online Archive of California has a lot of photos, has a lot of pictures, and it connects to everything from like the Huntington and Stanford and the Bancroft at Berkeley, all the way down to, you know, what they have at like Sac State in terms of historical collections. So you'll get a really good sense of what all's out there and who has what. You know, just like give it a spin and see what they have. Another thing to check out is the National Archives. They have a huge amount of sources, like all the service records I alluded to, the National Archives has. In fact, they have one single warehouse in Vandiver, Illinois, that has all of those. So it's like a huge military type warehouse. Like you ever see Raiders of the Lost Ark? At the very end when they put, yeah, it's basically that. It's kind of crazy, but you know, they need a place to put all that stuff. The Library of Congress is fantastic too. They have a wonderful collection of photos, over 200,000 alone from just the Great Depression. Google Books, how many people are on Ancestry.com? Yeah, it's an incredible resource. The Family History Library in Salt Lake City, they've done a lot of really great stuff over the years, cataloging stuff. Public libraries, there's a ton of wonderful databases that you can have access to through just the Sacramento Public Library. And then there's not so obvious places like, you know, sometimes corporations will share their sources. I did a lot of my work, my book, in courthouses in rural Nebraska. I had some stories about that, by the way. That was a lot of fun. So let's bring it back to the here and now and to what we're doing. So primary sources in the Orangevale Historical Society. So with all that stuff in mind about sources, right, let's think about, for one thing, documents that are worth saving. So what should we save? And that's, I think, a really vital question we should be asking ourselves, because there's not a whole lot of room here, right? And we don't want to get in a position where we get box after box after box, you know, we don't know what to do with them. For one thing, the community member narratives and interviews, those are fantastic. And I love seeing what what's been done so far, it's incredible. I mean, you're really engaging with people in the community. I love seeing that. It's so great. And that's something that so many historical societies aren't doing. And you guys are doing it. And that's awesome. Reaching out to especially like older folks who, really want to share their stories about Orangevale, about growing up here. That's incredible. And, just taking those stories, recording those, that's so wonderful. I did this, my next book is about my grandfather, and I inherited 600 letters that he wrote to his parents during World War II. He was a Pearl Harbor survivor. So he was in like the entire span of America's involvement in the war, because he spent the whole time in the Pacific. He was involved in it. So as useful and beneficial and illuminating as those letters are, probably the most important single thing I have for that book is a 3-hour oral interview I did with my grandpa about 2 years before he died. And we covered a lot of ground. And so I always go back to that interview because there's a lot of stuff in there, and a lot of nuance that, otherwise I would be sort of lost without it. So that's really important. That's awesome. Keep that up. That's great. Ephemera, flyers, leaflets, advertisements, school play programs, anything like that, anything that's published in a very small, circulation or very small amount. Anything like that is a very useful thing to save, because those things tend to get lost in attics and get thrown away. And so those are some of the things that are really hardest to recover. And really the same thing goes for like yearbooks and things like that. I recently had this, does anybody have a collection of Casa Robles, is that how you say it? My daughter's in like pre-K, so there you go. That's, yeah. So my high school, I went to high school in Missouri. Recently, one of the secretaries there basically went on like our alumni site, like, oh, I have all these yearbooks. And so I went on there like, does the library have those? And I checked the library. No, there's no single collection of yearbooks from my high school. And that kind of shocked me a little bit because, someday my kid might want to look at, dad's picture and look how geeky he looked, with the shiny red hair back in high school. So, I want to make sure she's able to do that and make fun of me. So I actually co-opted my mom to go and collect like one yearbook from each year and then take them to the St. Louis County Library, because otherwise those might get lost, and in 20, 30 years, you'll start seeing these gaps where no one has that yearbook because they get thrown away and, they get water damage and all sorts of things happen to them. This is Missouri, there's tornadoes and floods there all the time. So it's good to have stuff like that that's just very limited in circulation. So anything like that, yearbooks, programs, anything like that we can get our hands on, that's a really useful thing. Did you?
Can I add one that I found really hard to find? That's old telephone books.
Okay.
And they're a great resource. We've got a few in Fair Oaks, but there's probably a lot in barns and garages here for the collecting before they're burned.
That's a very good point. Yeah, absolutely. Good one. White pages, yellow pages, anything like that. Anything you think might have been tossed out in great amounts, by people just clearing out their closets, their garages, that's definitely something we want to keep. Photographs and pictures are other good ones. I know we're already doing that. Orangevale maps is another really good one. Maps get tossed out a whole lot, and they're never saved quite as often as other things like newspapers. So anything like a map, and also maps get destroyed, pretty easily just through use. So any maps we can get, that's super useful. Original sources like journals, letters, anything like that is obviously gold. Although you might want to talk with the donor and just make sure that they're okay with it being here. Because something like that, like especially old letters, early 20th century, late 19th century, they're going to need a little bit more of a climate control situation, because it does get damp here during the winter. And, you want to have temperature control. And that's one thing that archival collections do really well, is safeguarding these old documents. So that's just like a conversation you want to have. If anybody wants to give their journals or letters or anything like that. Yeah.
So yeah, I was thinking, should we be partnering with Sacramento library system, their archivists, the Sacramento room, all that stuff, and once we start getting things to safeguard them like that, once we have it digitized?
I think that's a really good idea, and that's something we should think about. And that's one of the things that I sort of prompt in the last slide is, what sort of institutional partnerships do we want to have? Generally speaking, there's not a whole lot between local historical societies and like other archival collections, and it really just comes down to politics. And one collection they'll have like a certain emphasis or whatever. So there's a lot of there's a weird discontinuity between what's on the local level and what like regional repositories will have. Now that's not an unbridgeable gap, and that's certainly something we can discuss with Sacramento Public Library would be a good partner. Sierra College is actually just now, I know they're Placer County, but they are just now starting to create an actual, legitimate archive for some of their old stuff. So like that would be a possibility too. So I mean, there's a lot of different, potential partners that we have for that. So, if we have older stuff, more quote unquote valuable stuff, all right, let's just say irreplaceable stuff, that might be something to consider. Instead of like having it all over the place, right? Which would be the what would happen otherwise. Any other ones? Things that we should save? Things that are important to you to save? Okay. Well, let's talk about things we shouldn't be saving. Newspapers are a good one, with the exception of the Orangevale View. I don't know if we've talked to the publisher yet about the Orangevale View. It'd be great if we have back issues of that. If we don't, somebody please start saving them. Whenever it lands in your mailbox and you're done reading it, just put it in a pile. I don't think we have any of those back issues. So something like that would be a really valuable, important thing for us to have. But if we're just talking newspaper clippings, magazines, things like that, almost all that stuff is digitized already. And it's full text, it's searchable. You can get it on ProQuest, which is a service that they have at Sacramento Public Library. So something like that, we don't really need to keep. And especially when someone has like all these different clippings and stuff. Like one thing you can do if it's really important and you want to signpost it, either take the ones that are important, put them in a separate folder, or you can even take the citations from those different articles, just write them down in a document someplace. But newspapers really add up very fast, and someone's already done that work of digitizing them.
Well, I just want to double check that it actually has been digitized.
SACB has.
Well, yeah, SACB, Union, that kind of stuff.
Right.
If there's some other newspapers that have been more local, like you said, the Orangevale.
Yeah, definitely not. So the digitization there's a bunch of different like overlapping newspaper digitization projects. Some out of the Family History Library Congress does a lot. There's some in California, Chronicling California. And so there's like a wide variety of different newspapers that are covered by that. But yeah, in all likelihood, if it's local, as in like Eastern Sacramento County, I would err on the side of caution. And if you don't find it, then I would definitely save it. Yes?
What about high school articles? Because those probably are not digitized.
Definitely save those. Yeah, high school news, that's another really good one. Yeah, high school newspapers, if we can find those, get copies of those, anything from high school newspapers, that's definitely not in the public record. One good way to find out and check for sure, I don't have this as one of my sources here, but if you go to worldcat.org, WorldCat is a worldwide, literally it's called World Catalog. It's a worldwide catalog of everything in libraries. So it's a really great way to see who has different newspapers, if they're available someplace. So if you search, what's the local high school newspaper?
El Carnero.
Okay, so if you search WorldCat for that and nothing comes up, then you know nobody has it.
Well, that's what
I don't think that's what CASA calls it.
probably not. 50 years ago, okay?
Because my kids went to CASA and we didn't have it called that.
One of the more frustrating things about doing late 19th century history is every time a newspaper changes editors, they also change like the name of the newspaper. And every newspaper had like a political bent to it. So if you have a guy who's like a populist, you'll have like the North Platte Independent. And then 2 years, like a Republican buys it out, and then it's the North Platte Republican. And then 3 years later, a Democrat buys it out, then it's the North Platte Democrat. But it's the same newspaper, you know, and it's hard to follow that along sometimes.
Our local papers changed names 3 times
Yeah.
in 50 years.
Okay. So, you know, another great example of that. So, you know, key in every iteration you can think of. And if no one around here has it, then no one has it. So WorldCat's a really good way to find out for sure whether or not, you know, some institution has these saved. But by all means, if it's a local thing like a high school newspaper, the Orangevale View, save it. Because as far as I know, there's no record of that that's fully digitized and easily available. But if it's something more national, if it's a magazine, if it's like the New York Times or whatever, yeah, just we don't need those. Same thing with like form letters, statements, things like that. If it's something that you see a lot of it, you know, we probably don't need it. Private papers are sort of a different situation. Private papers might have a lot of revealing information in them, social security numbers, things like that. So we want to be really careful when we take anything that's newer than say like 50 years, because it might have that information in it. And you know, that can be something that if it's publicly available, if it's not redacted, then we can be breaking federal law. So, you know, be sure to definitely bear that in mind. The same thing goes for school documents too. Report cards, anything like that. You know, we definitely want to not have those available, right? So sorry, you won't be seeing your parents' report card from high school, right? You know, unless you already have it. So it's that kind of thing, right? We want to safeguard personal information. So there's definitely like a nebulous area there between history and historical preservation on the one hand, and you know, things that involve you all and or me or our families today that can be used against us. So that's definitely something we'd be kind of mindful of. Copyrighted materials is kind of a similar thing. If it's a book, if it's a movie, something like that, we want to be kind of careful with it. We probably don't need it because we can probably get a copy of it or somebody else can get a copy of it. But also, you know, if we're doing things like digitizing it, putting it on the website, obviously that's a copyright issue legally. And then, you know, the last thing I have here is antiquarian and hyperlocal information. And this is kind of a delicate thing to talk about because this is Orangevale, your Orangevale. I'm a newcomer here. I've only lived here for almost like about 4 years now, right? So, you know, I can't speak to what was important 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. You know, but I guess it just sort of depends on what your filter is for history that's worth saving, right? So if it's a story that, you know, maybe you and your high school friends, you know, think is cool, or some restaurant you go to back 30 years ago and you have a whole bunch of stuff from it, like just, you want to think about the context and how applicable it is, not necessarily to like people outside of Orangevale, but people like 30 years from now. So things that are important to us might not be so important to the next generation, the generation, you know, after that. As anybody who's ever sorted through their parents' stuff after they've passed away knows, and there's a lot of stuff you throw out, a lot of stuff you keep, you know, but there's also a lot of stuff, I don't need that. We just did that with my father-in-law. So going through all that stuff, you know, and like, what are we just going to get rid of? So history is a little bit like that, right? In the sense that we're going to be getting things that may not just be that relevant or may not be that important, and you don't have to save it if it's not. Okay, so there's no law saying that you have to keep everything. So just be judicious about it, you know, and think about how applicable is this going to be to people outside of Orangevale, to the next generation, and so on. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned saving was photographs and pictures.
Right.
Are they worth saving if you don't know where it is or who's in it?
Sure. Because someone can always come by later and identify it. And one of the other nice things too of photographs is, you know, we can digitize them, make them freely available. You know, like even if we can't identify it, hopefully down the line somebody will. And so there's you know, annotations for that too. You can put undated, unknown, you know, just words like that, and then fill in the blanks later if you need to. Just a couple words about resources, right? The more you save, the more difficult it is. You know, obviously we only have so much room here. Do we have any offsite storage for this stuff? Yeah. So the more we bring in, the more that's going to pose, you know, a storage solution. More money, more expenses, and particularly if we're getting really important stuff like personal papers, things like that, we're going to have people wanting to see those. The more institutional partnerships we have, if we have those things on site, then someone might come knocking on our door at some point wanting to see those things. So, you know, who's going to show up and show those documents to them? What are the reading room rules going to be? You know, and all those things have to be kind of sorted out. So the more stuff we get, the more we kind of have to run into those decisions. So, you know, think in terms about scalability and resources. So it may not be worth it to have a whole bunch of stuff in the long run. That's probably directed at me. So the last two things, I have 2 slides left, I promise. So ideas for categorizing documents. Yes, sorry.
One of the things that the research committee is doing is we're starting to write stories of the people. So we're not interviewing these people, they're not even alive. So we're thinking that we will put this online.
Okay.
Is that the best way to handle it?
Yeah, absolutely. Throw them online, and you know, if anybody wants to add to them or take away from them, that, or you know, challenge anything in those biographies, then they can do that.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a great thing. So
Yeah.
any other questions or suggestions? Yeah.
We've had an interesting thing over in Fair Oaks. There's like a Fair Oaks happening type thing. And I think it's through the Historical Society, and people pose a question like, how long have you lived here? And then the people that respond, you know, scores and scores of people respond, and they talk about when their family moved here or something of the historical nature. So those online, I don't know what you'd call them, sort of chat sites,
Right.
really dig out a lot of dates and places and names. I find it kind of incredible. People put pictures of things.
Yeah.
That we never in the past were able to get out to the community, to the outreach to people.
That's a really good idea. And I already see that people are doing that with the Facebook page. So with all the questions and posts and things like that. So that's definitely the beginnings of something like that here. So yeah.
I can see, I mean, I think that happens with Orangevale Happenings. I think there's another Facebook besides Orangevale Happenings, but there's a lot of that type of thing. But if we don't capture it, you know, we lose that information, it kind of goes away. It's stuff to the bottom.
That's a good point. So
How do we capture that?
I don't know. I'm not on the research team.
We continue to push our own page. Talk to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, you know, just like periodically aggregate it, you know, and put it in a Word file or something like that. That's a really good idea. So yeah, social media makes it easier, but also adds the complexity of saving that stuff. And especially something like Facebook, which is so sort of bizarrely run sometimes. You know, it's kind of hard to parse the way they do and make some of their decisions. Actually, this is one area where it'd be nice to have a projector. But so for donations, in terms of organizing stuff, so if you get something like a big chunk of stuff donated, so a good way to think about that is to sort of enclose that in its own collection. So if you go to an archival repository, that's how they do it. So you have like the so-and-so collection, or you know, it could be something small like the Walter Smith collection, or something big like the Union Pacific collection, right? And then you kind of subcategorize everything from there. So there's definitely a hierarchy, institution, then family, then individual. So if you just have the individual, you don't have anything from their family or their institution, then that's an individual collection. You know, if it's a bunch of family papers, it's a family collection. If it's a local business or something like that, then that's a business collection. So, you know, that's a really good way to kind of approach that. I know you have some thoughts in terms of, and stuff in terms of categorizing things. For pictures, organize and digitize thematically. So, whenever someone donates pictures, just put them all in one place for each donor, but digitize them all and have them all cross-referenced. So in that way, it's easy to, separate out a keyword or an individual or all the unknown photographs or something like that. Yes.
So they're like, certain pictures over here that I was looking through.
Yeah.
I recognize some of the people from back when. So if I was to scan those, then I would put keywords in identifying those particular people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, every digital image has metadata associated with, and that's something that, you can talk a little bit more about. And I don't know what program we're going to use for all that, but, if we have one single place for all the photos, then it's an easy enough thing to cross-reference them. And then that way you can pull up a keyword or person or whatever. For periodicals and publications, you want to group those together. So all of the high school newspapers go in one collection. All the Orangevale Views, that's one collection. Yearbooks, et cetera, and so forth. In the PowerPoint, I have a link to Nebraska history. And it's partly biased because I've done a lot of work there, but they have a fantastic real project society. They do a lot of work and a lot of archival work. So search for, just like kind of check it out and surf around and check out the different container collections and see how they organize all that information. Every container has like a scope of collection, which is basically an introduction to what it is. And then they'll have, each container, each folder is listed with whatever you're putting in those different things. So definitely check that out and just kind of get a sense for those of you who are going to be doing the archival stuff, get a sense for how like some of these professional organizations do it. And it's an easy enough thing to kind of pick up, just, surf around, look at some of the collections and kind of check that out. Yeah.
Do they share their platform, like Postgres database, some kind of library archiving software?
They don't share the software, and that's sort of immaterial, but they do share, the formatting of, all their different collections. I mean, it's all searchable. And they want it to be searchable. They want, like Nebraska history, they want everybody to know what they have. And if there's something that I want, they want me to know if they have it or not, because that's how they get their funding. And honestly, that's how a lot of these organizations get their funding, right? So if no one's showing up to do research there, then they're going to, some people are going to lose their jobs. So, that's definitely something to kind of bear in mind. All that stuff is out there. It's usually public. But especially for like a government associated historical society like Nebraska's, because that's a taxpayer funded enterprise. That's not always the case with private archives. So if you don't find one like in a private archive, and they probably don't have the staffing for it, or the money to do that. But yeah.
We talked about a lot about paper and this type of thing, some things we can digitize. What about articles of things such as, let's say somebody has old toys? Artifacts, okay, let's solve that, yeah. What do we look for in asking the community for those type of things before they're thrown away? And,
Well, so that's sort of a tricky area because, artifacts are definitely something that adds to space. And it is so easy to accrue a whole shelf full of different artifacts. But that's a question you want to ask yourselves. Like, what kinds of artifacts do you want? And it's okay to not want any. There's always going to be eBay and antique stores and things like that. Because unless it's something that's extraordinarily rare and highly local, for instance, something a junior achievement company might have made, at the local high school. If you find something like that, we might want to keep that, but if it's something you can get on eBay, we probably don't need it. Yeah.
Look behind you, down on the shelf, with grinding stones.
Oh yeah. That is a very good and contentious thing to bring up. Because the local Maidu community, if they see that there, they could sue for it. Because that falls within the rubric of what they can reclaim from museums and from organizations like this. So I'll be very careful about things like that. Yeah. Well, if that's something you want to do, I didn't even think of this. I mean, that's a really good point. I would consult the local Maidu community and, talk to I don't know who what the tribal organization is there, but find out whoever's in charge of that and talk with them, and just have that discourse, about what we can do. And, that's something to think about too, in terms of what we preserve here. What is the indigenous history of Orangevale? That's important. That's the vast majority of the history here. It's before the gold rush. Yeah.
So, I've toyed with that. I've been in the Historical Society in Fair Oaks for 35 years, and you're absolutely right. You start getting stuff that bears no relation, but a family wants to donate it. So you've got to be really careful about that. But some of the things that I've found interesting are, for example, restaurant menus from local restaurants, actual products. We have cans of Fair Oaks olives and Fair Oaks olive oil bottles. And then when an organization goes out of existence, like the Fair Oaks Fire District, we got all their records, we got their helmets, we got some of the equipment, things even like political posters and political bumper stickers from local politicians over the years. Someday,
those are great
when
examples.
they're forgotten, that makes interesting exhibits.
No, thanks for bringing that up. Those are some great examples of things that we can keep, and should keep, for posterity. So anything, something like that, falls in our lap. I mean, we definitely want to have a plan for where to keep it, what to do with it.
And you definitely got a policy for what you don't accept. You got to have a screening process, or else you build up a storage building or a storage facility like we've got, full of stuff that we don't know what to do with.
If you can go down to Antique Trove and probably find it there, then we probably don't need it. Yeah. But thanks for bringing that up. I mean, those are some great examples of things that we should definitely keep. Yeah.
I would think that for things like that people want to donate or so forth, if we could get pictures of them and document them with the family's name and so forth, then we could keep the picture. We have the memory, and then they can let the thing go to the universe, wherever.
Right.
And that's been working in my family to get rid of stuff, because the younger generation doesn't want stuff, they want the memory.
Right.
And so we send a lot of things to the universe after it's photographed. And that could be everything from Goodwill to eBay to you name it.
That's a great idea.
So that might take care of some of these things that people want to donate to us. I'm hearing of a chair, it was a chair in the Calder house. Was it a chair or something? Couch or something?
Mm-hmm.
We have no place for that.
Oh, it's in her living room.
Yeah.
Well, one possibility might be like a rummage sale every year.
And I also heard, yes, somebody had an article of clothing, and but we could certainly take good pictures of it.
Yeah.
Or a quilt or something like that.
And put it in their collection.
Right. No, that's excellent. And also, like, one possibility too is, there might be a local museum that actually deals in those kinds of things. Like, there's a computing museum in San Jose. So if there's any old computers, they might take a look at it and want one.
One thing I was thinking of, like over in Fair Oaks, we've got collections of old clothing from the turn of the century, the 1900 one. And when you start getting into the realm of educating people and outreach and exhibits, it might be interesting to have some of these things in a storage place or somewhere, so that if you do a special exhibit on clothes of an era, toys of an era, or something like that, if you're thinking in terms of future exhibition and shows, maybe you have some categories that you want to collect in, old farm implements or something. I think we had a ton of them out at the Fair Oaks Cemetery around their property. They're still there. They're rusting away, but they're there. They were saved.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, a lot of possibilities with that. But I think as long as you have a plan for cycling through them, and for getting rid of maybe some of the things that we don't need, as long as you attach a story behind it. Like, here's this chair from such and such family, and here's the history behind it. And that way someone else at least gets to use it instead of it just sitting and collecting dust. So, but definitely a lot of possibilities there. I just have a couple final thoughts. I'm just about done. And thanks for your patience. And this is my first time teaching in a year and a half. Yeah, I've missed it. It's fun. So I've belabored anything, that's why. So digitization is fantastic, but it's not free. So everything we digitize, that's time. Like I mentioned my grandpa's letters earlier, that's taken so much time to digitize all that stuff. It's a huge task. So just bear that in mind for digitizing things. Have a plan for original documents. We've already talked about that. How accessible do we want to be with researchers for, original collections, local institutions, we talked about that too, and, to the local community. And the last thing I want to mention, or actually two more things I want to mention. The first thing is just historical literacy. And a lot of what I've been talking about up here today is just historical literacy and not being a history buff, right? That's sort of a separate thing from learning about World War II or watching a Ken Burns documentary or something, right? Historical literacy is how is history preserved? How is it written? How is it maintained? How is it cited and sourced, right? And that's just a really important thing that I wish more people knew about, because especially in these hypercharged political times, there's a lot of discourse out there that, I think isn't entirely fair to my profession, frankly, So knowing how history is made, how it's cited, that's definitely something that my involvement here, that's something I want to promote and push. Like, how do historians work? What do we do? And as a, producer and preserver of history, how can the Orangevale Historical Society promote historical literacy? So I'm really interested in that and hearing ideas on that. And that doesn't mean that everything I say is right. That doesn't mean that my entire book is right. Like there's a lot of wrong stuff in it. I got a letter yesterday pointing out 3 things I got wrong. Okay, thank you for that. I wish you would have told me a year ago. So doesn't mean we get everything right all the time, but it does mean that, we try our best and we show our work. So historical literacy. And the last thing, and I've already run this by Marilyn, but I want to start a monthly reading group on California history, just so we can see what all is out there and not just, like Orangevale history is obviously why we're here, but, like I want to read about the gold rush. I want to read about the 20th century, just like once a month, get a reading group together so we can read a little more broadly and help contextualize Orangevale within some of these really big things that are happening in California, in the United States, and elsewhere. So I just want to help, like, have a reading group that comes together, connect some of those dots, explore some good books, and then that way when people ask us questions, I want to read more about the gold rush or something like that, then that way we have something to recommend them. So that's it. Thank you so much for your patience. So.